The whistle came 3 long blasts and 1 short, the signal every soul in Lossman Creek had learned to dread. And Naomi Hale's chalk snapped in half against the schoolhouse board before she even understood why her hand had closed so hard around it. She was out the door before the children had finished rising from their benches, running down the rutted street toward the black mouth of the Sentinel shaft with her skirts fisted in both hands, and she was not the only one running. The whole town poured toward the mine the way water finds a low place, drawn by a dread everyone recognized before anyone said the word aloud. Cave-in. The mountain had taken something from them again, and Naomi's whole body already knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason, that it had taken Josiah. The mine yard was chaos by the time she reached it. Women clutching shawls closed against the cold, men shouting orders that contradicted each other. And at the center of it, calm in a way that made Naomi want to strike him, stood Cornelius Drummond, owner of the Sentinel, consulting a pocket watch as though the collapse of his own mine were an inconvenience to his schedule, rather than a catastrophe swallowing 6 men alive. "How many?" Naomi said, reaching the foreman, Amos Prout, before her breath had come back to her. "How many are down there, Amos?" "6, Prout said, gray-faced, not meeting her eyes. "Sublevel 3 working the new drift. Vane's crew." The name went through her like the mountain's own collapse. Josiah. She had loved Josiah Vane for 2 years in the particular silence of a woman who has decided her feelings are her own business and no one else's, ever since the winter he'd stood up in the general store and told Otto Kettleman to hold his tongue about the schoolteacher's plain dresses, before he'd so much as spoken 3 words to her directly. She had told herself since then that it was foolishness, that a miner too proud to court above his wages and a schoolteacher too proud to chase a man who hadn't asked were destined to stand a careful distance apart forever. She had never told him. She had never told anyone. And now the ground had swallowed him whole, and she understood, standing in the cold mine yard with her heart trying to climb out of her chest, that she would have given every year of careful silence back for 1 more day, of simply seeing him walk up from the shaft at shift's end. She had come to Lossman Creek 5 years before, an orphaned girl of 21 with a teaching certificate and no family left to speak of, answering an advertisement for a schoolmistress the way another woman might have answered one for a bride, out of necessity more than adventure. She had built her whole life since then out of careful, independent things. A rented room above the milliner's, a schoolroom she kept clean and orderly, a reputation as a sensible woman not given to foolishness. Josiah Vane had been the one foolishness she had never quite managed to reason herself out of, not since the day Otto Kettleman had called her a dried-up old maid within her own hearing, and Josiah, a stranger to her then, had set down his purchases and told Kettleman plainly that a woman who spent her days teaching other men's children her letters deserved better manners than that from a man who could barely write his own name. He had not lingered afterward for thanks. He had simply nodded to her once and gone back to his work, and Naomi had gone home that night and admitted to no one, least of all herself in any words she'd let form fully, that she had fallen a little in love with a miner she had never properly met. Word spread through the mine yard within the hour of whose crew had been lost, and it was not only Josiah's name that struck fear into waiting hearts. Sally stood near the shaft mouth with 3 children clinging to her skirts, her husband Ezra among the 6 trapped below, and Naomi went to her first, before she went anywhere else, because grief recognized itself and required no explanation between women who shared it. "They'll bring him up," Naomi said, taking Sally's cold hands in her own. "I don't know how yet, but they will." "You don't know that," Sally said, though she gripped Naomi's hands back hard enough to bruise. "No," Naomi admitted, "but I know I won't stop trying until I do know it, one way or the other, and I'd ask the same of you, for Ezra's sake and your children's. Sally's youngest, a boy of perhaps 4, tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked when Papa was coming home for supper. And it was that small, uncomprehending question, more than anything Drummond or Prout had said all evening, that hardened Naomi's resolve into something with no give left in it at all. "We'll know more by dark," Prout said. "The drift's unstable, can't send men in blind." "Then send them in careful," Naomi said, "but send them." By evening, the town had gathered at the mine mouth in numbers that felt, to Naomi, less like hope and more like a wake being held early. Lanterns burned along the ridge. The preacher, Reverend Hollies, had begun murmuring low prayers to a cluster of women who wept openly, and it was that, more than anything, that told Naomi how far gone the town's hope already was, that a man of God had come not to pray for a rescue, but to prepare grieving families for a loss not yet confirmed. Cornelius Drummond climbed onto an overturned ore cart to address the crowd, and Naomi watched him with a dislike that had crystallized into something harder in the hours since morning. "Neighbors," Drummond said, in the tone of a man reading from a prepared statement rather than speaking from any grief of his own, "I share your sorrow at this tragedy. But I have consulted with my foreman and my engineers, and the drift where the men were working has suffered a secondary collapse that renders further excavation extremely hazardous, both to any rescuers and to the stability of the mine as a whole. At first light, for the safety of this town and this operation, I intend to seal the Sentinel's lower workings." The crowd's murmur rose, disbelieving, grieving, but Naomi heard beneath it something worse: acceptance. People who had already, in their private hearts, given the 6 men up for dead, relieved to have permission to stop hoping. "You mean to bury them alive," Naomi said, loud enough to carry, stepping forward before she had decided to, "without knowing if they're dead at all." Drummond looked down at her from the ore cart with the particular condescension of a wealthy man addressing a schoolteacher he did not consider worth arguing with. "Miss Hale, I understand your distress, but the engineering assessment is clear. Continued excavation risks a full collapse that could kill any rescue party and cost this town its only mine besides. I have a responsibility to the living." "You have 6 living men down there," Naomi said. "Unless you can prove to me, right now, with more than a convenient assessment from an engineer you pay, that those men are already dead, you have no right to seal that shaft." "And who are you," Drummond said, "to instruct me on my own property?" "I'm the woman who intends to dig that mountain apart with her bare hands before I let you bury 6 men to save yourself the cost of a slower rescue," Naomi said, and the crowd went very quiet, because something in her voice made it clear she meant every word of it literally. She did not, in fact, have to dig with her bare hands, though by the 3rd hour of the night she had blistered both of them badly enough that it might as well have been so. Old Silas Coote, a miner near 70 who'd worked the Sentinel since it opened and had a grudge against Drummond going back a decade over a payment dispute, was the first to fall in beside her with a pick over his shoulder, saying only, "Vane pulled my grandson out of a slide 2 winters back. I don't leave a debt like that unpaid." Behind him came 3 more of the older miners, men Drummond had recently let go to trim wages, who had nothing left to lose by defying him, and every reason in the world to want to see him proven wrong. Aggie Vane, Josiah's mother, frail and bent with the lung sickness that had kept her housebound for 2 years, insisted on being carried down to the mine yard in a chair rather than wait at home for news. And it was the sight of her, gray and shaking and refusing to leave, until her son was brought up one way or another, that finally shamed enough of the town's men into joining the effort that Drummond found himself, by midnight, facing a crowd of diggers. He could not simply order away without the whole county hearing of it by morning. "You cannot do this without my authorization," Drummond told Naomi, finding her ankle-deep in rubble at the mouth of the old ventilation shaft, a narrower secondary passage that Silas swore ran close enough to the collapsed drift to reach it faster than clearing the main tunnel. "This is still my property, and I will have the sheriff remove the lot of you if I must." "Then fetch him," Naomi said, not pausing in her work. "By the time he rides out from town and back, Mr. Drummond, we'll either have those men out or we won't, and either way you'll have your answer about whether your engineer's assessment was worth 6 lives." Drummond's mouth thinned, but something in the gathered crowd's silence, in the set of Silas Coote's shoulders, and the grim faces of the men digging behind her, told even him that removing them by force tonight would cost him more in the town's regard than he could afford to lose. He did not fetch the sheriff. He stood at the edge of the lantern light instead, watching, his pocket watch forgotten, and Naomi understood that she had won herself only time, not victory, and that time was the one thing the men trapped below might not have to spare. Harlan Voss found her an hour before midnight, when her hands had begun to shake too badly to hold the shovel steady, and pressed a canteen of water into them, along with an argument she did not want to hear. Harlan ran the dry goods store and had been calling on Naomi with a patient, respectable courtship for the better part of a year, bringing her books from his supply orders and walking her home from church with a steadiness she had always appreciated, even as she'd known, in the quiet, honest part of herself, that she felt nothing for him beyond fondness, the way one might feel for a kind neighbor. "Naomi, you'll kill yourself out here," Harlan said. "Your hands are torn to ribbons. Come sit by the fire a while. The men can dig without you." "The men can," Naomi said, "but I won't leave while there's a chance." "A chance for Vane," Harlan said, and something in his voice, quiet and unhappy, told her he had understood, perhaps before she had fully admitted it to herself, exactly whose survival she was digging for. "I've called on you a year, Naomi." I'd hoped. He stopped himself, looked at her raw hands, at the fierce, exhausted set of her face turned toward a mountain that had swallowed another man whole. "Never mind what I hoped. Here." He picked up a second shovel from the pile. "If you won't rest, I won't stand here uselessly holding a canteen." He dug beside her for the rest of the night without complaint and without further mention of his own hopes, and Naomi understood, watching him, that whatever else was true of him, Harlan Voss was a decent man, and that decency, offered freely with no further claim attached, was its own kind of grace she would not forget. Near 2 in the morning, a support timber gave way without warning in the narrow shaft, and one of the younger diggers, a boy named Cyrus Platt, not yet 20, was struck across the forearm by a falling chunk of rock and came out of the passage white-faced and cradling a wrist that hung wrong. It was not the collapse everyone had been dreading, but it was enough to remind the whole yard how easily it could be, and Naomi watched 3 of the men who had come down from the ridge to help now hang back at the shaft mouth, murmuring to one another that perhaps Drummond's engineers had the right of it after all, that perhaps 6 lives already lost were not worth risking a 7th. "We could be digging graves for ourselves and calling it rescue," one of them said, not quite quiet enough that Naomi failed to hear it, and for one terrible moment she felt the whole effort teetering, the way a wagon teeters at the top of a grade before it decides which way to fall. "Then don't come down," Naomi said, turning to face them with dust in her hair and blood dried on both palms. "Nobody's asking any man to risk what he's not willing to risk. But I am going back down that shaft, with or without you, because there are 6 men trapped in the dark who'd do the same for any one of us, and I'd rather die knowing I tried than live knowing I didn't. Silas, are you with me?" was never anywhere else, Silas said, already moving back toward the shaft mouth. Shamed, or perhaps simply reminded of what kind of men they wanted to be able to say they were, the three who had hung back picked their tools back up, and Cyrus Platt himself, wrist splinted crudely by his own mother, insisted on holding a lantern one-handed at the shaft mouth rather than go home, saying he'd not leave until he'd seen it through to the end, one way or another. The work went on past midnight into the deep black hours when even lantern light seems to thin, and it was grinding, brutal work. Timber and rock hauled out bucket by bucket through a shaft barely wide enough for a man to crawl. The air inside growing worse the deeper they went, thick with rock dust and the particular staleness of ground that had not seen air in hours. By 1 in the morning, the bad air had become its own enemy, lanterns guttering low in the narrowest stretch of the passage, and Silas Coot called a halt to rig a bellows contraption from an old forge blower hauled down from his own smithy, running a length of canvas hose ahead of the diggers to force fresher air down toward the working face. It cost them the better part of an hour they could ill afford to lose, and twice Naomi wanted to scream at the delay, watching precious time bleed away, while 6 men waited in the dark, not knowing whether anyone was coming for them at all. But Silas, calm as ever, reminded her that a digger fainted dead from bad air helped no one, and that haste without sense had killed more miners over the years than any collapse had. Patience, Silas told her, working the bellows crank himself despite his age, sweat cutting clean tracks through the dust on his face. I know it's the last thing you want to hear tonight, girl, but Patience got my grandson out of a slide once, and it'll get Vane out of this one too. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. Naomi swallowed her impatience because she had no better answer to give him, and within the hour the fresher air let them push forward again at a pace that no longer left men gasping and dizzy every few minutes of work. And she understood, grudgingly, that the delay had likely saved lives rather than cost them. Twice the passage shifted with a groan that sent everyone scrambling backward, certain the whole ventilation shaft meant to collapse atop them the way the drift already had, and twice Silas Coot, calm as a man discussing weather, examined the new cracks by lantern light and pronounced them holding. For now, though his voice carried less certainty the second time than the first. It was near 3 in the morning when Naomi, crawling ahead of the others through the narrowest stretch of the shaft with a lantern held before her, heard it. A sound so faint she nearly convinced herself she had imagined it. A rhythmic tapping against rock, 3 strikes, a pause, 3 strikes again. "Quiet," she shouted back down the tunnel, and the digging stopped. And in the sudden stillness the tapping came again, unmistakable now. A man's signal, the old miner's code for "I am alive, I am here." "They're alive," Naomi said, and her voice broke entirely on the words. 2 years of careful silence, and 1 night of raw terror dissolving all at once into tears. She did not try to stop. "Silas, they're alive. Do you hear it?" "I hear it," Silas said, and even his weathered old face had gone bright with something like joy. "Dig, then. Dig like the devil's at your back, because that's about the size of it." Word of the tapping reached the surface within minutes, carried hand to hand along the line of diggers, and it changed the mine yard entirely. The wake became, all at once, a vigil with purpose. Women who had been weeping now boiling coffee and tearing cloth for bandages. Men who had hung back now stripping off coats to take a turn with pick or shovel. The whole town remembering, in the space of one relayed shout, what hope was for. It changed nothing in Cornelius Drummond, who came forward when he heard the news with an expression that Naomi, exhausted and furious in equal measure, would remember for the rest of her life, as the precise look of a man calculating loss rather than feeling relief. "If they're alive," Drummond said. "The drift is more unstable than we feared, not less. A rescue attempt now, breaking through into a chamber under pressure from the very collapse we're trying to contain, could bring the whole ceiling down on rescuers and trapped men alike. I am ordering the shaft sealed at first light regardless. We will attempt a proper excavation, engineered and safe, once the ground has settled over the coming weeks." "Weeks," Naomi said. "You mean to leave 6 living men down there to starve while your engineers write reports?" "I mean to prevent a dozen deaths in place of 6, Drummond said. "I am sorry, Miss Hale, truly, but I will not risk this town's remaining workforce on a rescue my own experts deem reckless." "Your experts are paid by you," Naomi said, "to tell you what costs you least. I have heard 3 miners' knocks from that mountain telling me something different, and I trust 3 men crawling through the dark toward the sound of their own rescue a great deal more than I trust a man who has not once gone near that shaft mouth all night." She turned from him before he could answer and went back down into the tunnel, and behind her she heard Silas Coote's voice, low and hard, informing Mr. Drummond that if he meant to bring dynamite anywhere near that shaft mouth before those men were out, he would have to come through every digger on the mountain first, and there were, by now, better than 30 of them. Drummond did not come through them himself. He sent for a blasting crew from the county seat instead, 2 men with a wagon load of dynamite who arrived just before 4 in the morning claiming Drummond's authority and Drummond's right to seal his own property however he saw fit. And it was the sheriff, roused from his bed and ridden out at Drummond's own insistence, who found himself standing between 2 crowds with equal claim on his conscience. "Sheriff Boone," Drummond said, "I am asking you, as the law in this county, to clear these people off my property so my men can do their work and end this before anyone else is hurt." "And I'm asking you, Sheriff," Naomi said, standing her ground at the shaft mouth with Silas and 30 tired, dust-covered diggers behind her, to listen to the sound that shaft's been making for the better part of 3 hours before you let this man blast it shut over 6 living souls. Sheriff Boone was an old friend of Silas Coote's from years back, and a man who had buried his own brother in a mine collapsed 2 counties over, and he stood a long moment listening to the low, rhythmic tapping that carried faintly up from the shaft mouth. 3 strikes, a pause, 3 strikes again, before he turned back to Drummond with an expression that had already made up its mind. "I hear 6 men signaling for rescue, Mr. Drummond," Boone said. "I'll not clear a single soul off this mountain while that sound's still coming up out of the ground. You want your dynamite crew working, you'll have to go through me first, and I promise you that'll take considerably longer than letting these good people finish what they started." Drummond's blasting crew, faced with an armed sheriff and a mountain of grim, determined diggers, packed their wagon and left without further argument, and Drummond himself retreated to the edge of the lantern light once more, beaten in a way that had nothing to do with dynamite and everything to do with a town that had finally stopped listening to him. The last hours before dawn were the worst of Naomi's life, worse even than the moment she had first heard the whistle, because now there was a shape to what might be lost, not an abstract dread, but the specific, unbearable possibility of Josiah's voice going silent again, after she had only just heard it confirmed alive, of reaching the chamber a half-hour too late, of the shaft groaning its final collapse with her own body crushed inside it alongside the men she'd come to save. The passage narrowed to where only one person could work at a time, and it fell to Naomi, smallest and most stubborn among them, to take the lead position, prying rock loose with a short bar while Harlan and Silas hauled debris back behind her, hand over hand down the line to men waiting to carry it clear. Her hands had long since stopped answering to pain as a separate thing from the work itself. Her arms shook with an exhaustion so complete it felt like a fever. And still she dug, because behind that wall of shattered rock was a man she had loved in silence for 2 years, and she had promised herself somewhere in the black hours of the night that if he died down there, he would not die without knowing it, without hearing, at least once, the words she had been too proud and too careful to say aloud while he still walked free in the daylight. The final breakthrough came just as the first gray light reached the mine yard above, a section of rock giving way all at once beneath her bar, opening into a small pocket of foul, dust-thick air, and beyond it, in the wavering light of her lantern, she saw him. Josiah Vane lay propped against a fallen timber, his leg pinned beneath rubble to the knee, his face gray with dust and thirst, but alive, unmistakably, gloriously alive. And behind him the shapes of 5 other men, exhausted and filthy, but still breathing, still stubbornly clinging to life, turned toward the light of her lantern like plants finally reaching after long-hidden sun. "Naomi," Josiah said, his voice a dry rasp of disbelief. "Is that you, truly you?" "It's truly me," Naomi said, and crawled the last few feet to him over broken rock, her hands finding his face, filthy and real and warm beneath her torn palms. "I told that mountain it couldn't have you. I've been telling it all night." Behind him, the other 5 men stirred toward the light, and Ezra Wentz, hoarse and barely able to speak, asked only after his wife and children before he asked anything else for himself, which told Naomi everything she needed to know about what kind of hours these 6 men had spent in the dark, thinking not of their own suffering, but of who waited above for them. She promised him Sally was well, that the children were safe and asking after him every hour, and watched relief break across his gray, exhausted face like sunrise. Josiah reached up with the one hand not pinned beneath the rubble and closed it around Naomi's wrist, weakly, but with a grip that told her he had not given up, whatever his voice's rasping weakness suggested otherwise. "I heard the digging," he said. "Hours of it. Told the others it had to be Sela's coot. Stubborn old fool wouldn't quit a job half done. Didn't dare hope it might be you leading it." "Believe it," Naomi said, pressing her forehead briefly to his, heedless of the dust and grime between them. "Now hold still. We're not done yet, but we're close, and I did not come this far, through half a mountain and a mine owner both, to lose you now to plain impatience in the last hour." Freeing Josiah's leg took another hour of careful, painstaking work, Sela's directing the removal of timber piece by piece, so as not to bring the unstable ceiling down on the very men they had crawled so far, and dug so long, and risked so much to save. And by the time they had him and the other 5 miners clear of the shaft and up into the gray morning light, the whole town had gathered at the mine mouth to see it. A crowd that cheered and wept in equal measure at the sight of 6 living men carried out on stretchers, rather than the 6 coffins everyone had quietly prepared themselves to expect. Sally Wentz reached Ezra's stretcher before it had even cleared the shaft mouth, weeping openly, her 3 children swept up against their father's dust-caked chest, in a tangle of small arms that made even the hardest of the diggers turn away to hide their own faces. And it was watching that reunion, as much as anything, that told Naomi the whole night's terror and blistered hands had been a fair trade after all. Cornelius Drummond stood at the edge of that crowd, with an expression Naomi did not have the grace, in that moment, to feel sorry for. And it was Reverend Hollies, of all people, who said aloud what half the town was thinking. "Mr. Drummond," the Reverend said, "I believe this town owes Miss Hale and these good men a debt we're not likely to forget soon, and I believe you owe them rather more than that, given you meant to seal that shaft over living men not 4 hours past." Drummond had nothing to say to that, and left the mine yard within the hour, and it would be told in Lossman Creek for years afterward, with considerable satisfaction, that the Sentinel's owner sold his interest in the mine before the season was out, unable to bear the weight of a town that no longer trusted a word he said. The town held a meeting at the church the following Sunday, ostensibly to give thanks for the rescue, though it turned quickly into something more practical once Reverend Hollies opened the floor to discussion. Sheriff Boone stood and proposed a miners' relief fund, paid into by whoever bought the Sentinel next, to see to widows and injured men regardless of an owner's convenient engineering assessments, and the whole congregation voted it through without a single dissenting voice. Silas Coote, seconding the motion, with a satisfaction that showed plainly he considered it a decade overdue. Naomi sat with Aggie Vane through the whole of it, Josiah still too weak to attend, but sent word by Cyrus Platt that he wanted his name added to the fund's founding roll the moment he was able to sign it himself. And by the time the meeting adjourned, Lossman Creek had accomplished more toward its own future safety in a single Sunday afternoon than Cornelius Drummond had managed in all his years of ownership. Otto Kettleman himself came to Naomi's schoolroom a week later, hat in hand, in a state of discomfort she had never before seen on so blustering a man, and offered an apology so halting she nearly took pity on him before he'd finished it. "I heard what you did out there, Miss Hale," Kettleman said, "digging half the night, standing up to a man like Drummond in front of the whole county. I said an unkind thing about you once, years back, and Vane set me straight on it then, and I expect I owe you my own apology now, considerably overdue." "Considerably," Naomi agreed, but she said it without malice, and accepted the small basket of provisions he'd brought as a peace offering, and Lossman Creek's opinion of her, which had already been quietly warm for years beneath its surface propriety, blossomed openly into something like town pride. The schoolteacher who had shamed a mine owner and dug 6 men out of the mountain with her own 2 hands becoming, within a season, the story every new arrival to town was told within their first week. Josiah's leg mended slow through a long convalescence in his mother's front room, and Naomi came every day to sit with Aggie and read to Josiah from whatever books Harlan Voss, with a generosity that cost him something and did him great credit, kept sending over from his store without ever being asked twice. Her schoolchildren took to visiting too. Once word got round that their teacher's rescued miner was recovering just down the lane, trooping in after lessons with wild flowers and clumsy, earnest drawings of the mountain, until Aggie declared the front room busier than the mercantile on a Saturday, and could not have looked more pleased about it. Cyrus Platt came by often as well, his wrist healing straight, to sit with Josiah and talk of the old days in the Sentinel before either of them had reason to fear it. And Sally once sent over pies enough that Aggie began threatening, with real affection, to have to let out every dress she owned. It was on a warm afternoon some 6 weeks after the collapse, with Josiah finally able to sit up unassisted, and color returned properly to his face, that he took Naomi's hand, the skin still marked from that long night's digging, and turned it over gently to look at the healing scars across her palm. "They told me after," he said, "what you did, standing up to Drummond in front of the whole yard, digging through half the night with your own hands when the men with the equipment had given up. I lay in that dark not knowing if I'd see another sunrise, and the last thought I had before I gave up trying to stay awake was of you, though I'd never once told you that, and never thought I had the right to." "Why not?" Naomi asked, though she thought she already knew the answer, had known it for 2 years in the careful, guarded part of her heart she had never let herself examine too closely. "Because I'm a miner with a sick mother and a wage that barely covers our needs," Josiah said, "and you're a schoolteacher who could have any man in this county with better prospects than mine. I told myself, It wasn't fair to ask you to wait on a man who might be crushed under a mountain any given Tuesday, same as my father was, and his father before him. Seemed crueler to speak than to stay silent. You foolish man, Naomi said, and found she was laughing and crying together, the way she had at the mouth of that shaft when she'd first heard his knock against the rock. I dug through a mountain half the night because I'd rather love a man who might be crushed under it than live safe and untouched loving no one at all. I've loved you 2 years in silence, Josiah Vane, since the day you stood up for me in Kettleman's store and never said another word about it. And I am done being silent, whatever your wages are or aren't. Then I'd best say it plain, so neither of us mistakes it again, Josiah said, drawing her hand to his chest, over the steady beat of a heart that had, against every reasonable expectation of that terrible night, kept beating. I love you, Naomi Hale. I have for longer than I let myself admit. If you'll have a man who comes with a bad leg healing crooked, and a mother to care for, and no great fortune to offer, I'll spend whatever years the mountain leaves me making certain you never once regret digging so hard to keep me in this world. I'll have him, Naomi said. Crooked leg, modest wages, stubborn pride and all. And outside the window the Lossman Creek afternoon went on gold and ordinary, the mountain that had nearly taken everything from her standing exactly where it always had, indifferent and enduring, while inside the little house 2 people who had each waited too long to speak finally said, plainly and at last, the words that had been true between them all along. They married that autumn, in the little church where Reverend Hollies had once murmured prayers over men everyone believed already lost, and half the county turned out to see it. Sally Wentz and her children in the front pew, Sela's coot standing straight and proud as any father of the bride, Cyrus Platt grinning with his mended arm, and even Otto Kettleman come to add his blessing, awkward but sincere. Harlan Voss stood near the back, and when Naomi caught his eye across the crowded little church, he only smiled and nodded, a man who had learned to want good things for people even when they weren't things he'd wanted for himself. And Naomi thought there were few finer gifts a person could give another than that. Josiah walked her down the aisle afterward on a leg that had healed crooked but held steady, leaning only slightly on the cane he'd likely need the rest of his days, and told her, as they stepped out into the bright autumn light together as husband and wife, that he intended to spend every one of those days proving he'd been worth the digging. Naomi told him, laughing, that he'd already proven it the moment she'd heard his knock against the rock in the dark. 3 strikes, a pause, 3 strikes again, the truest words either of them had ever heard, and the beginning of everything that came after.